When you start Hollow Knight, the first thing the game presents to you is the Elegy of Hallownest. This poem is just one example of Hollow Knight's cryptic approach to storytelling. Like a lot of the information that gets presented to the player throughout the game, the Elegy of Hallownest doesn't make much sense on its face. It's after exploring the world and gathering clues that one can put together the meaning behind some of what the game presents to you. It's almost like solving a puzzle. Coming back to the elegy after beating the game and discovering some of the lore of its world, it becomes clear that this poem is written about the Pale King, the former monarch of Hallownest who has long since disappeared by the time the player arrives. Part of the process of figuring out the details of the game's story comes from making connections between elements found all throughout the game. Once we realize that the elegy is written about the Pale King, it allows us to make a connection between the character of the Pale King and the short melody that is heard over top of this introduction. If we can connect this melody to the Pale King, then we can use that as an inherent implication whenever this theme is used throughout the game's score, to tie together characters or places as having a strong connection to the king. In this video, I want to explore some examples of this throughout the soundtrack, examining what that means for the game's story as well as how composer Christopher Larkin manages to build several distinct pieces of music out of the same basic melodic figure. So get your dream nails ready, folks. We're about to dive inside the mind of Christopher Larkin. The simplest and clearest example of this melody being used in-game is the White Lady's theme, which plays when visiting the character in the Queen's Gardens. Once married to the Pale King, the White Lady ruled as the Queen of Hallownest before the events of the game. To give you an idea of how Hollow Knight's approach to storytelling works, this fact is never explicitly stated in-game. Besides her living in the Queen's Gardens, her relationship to the Pale King is implied from the White Lady's dialogue and by her owning half of the King's soul, the other half of which can only be found on the Pale King's corpse. The connection between the two is further bolstered by her theme, which uses the exact melody from the Elegy of Hallownest. The simple arrangement of this theme gives us a great blueprint for Larkin's typical approach to arrangement. We have a statement of the melody, followed by another statement with a slight variation. This variation can be an instrumentation, harmony, melody, or all three. In this case, we see the raised sixth of the first phrase lowered to a natural sixth, and the major 4-chord harmonization traded out for a secondary 4-to-1 resolution to our A flat chord. Despite being in a minor key, there's a lot of lightness in this arrangement. The two moments I mentioned both add some brightness to the music, which combine with the resolution to C minor at the end of each phrase to create a bittersweet feeling. After the main melodic statements, Larkin often moves into a development section before returning to a climactic version of the initial melody to end off a piece. The White Lady's theme takes a short detour into a development section of 12 bars in length. These development sections will often develop themes by taking one of the supplemental melodic ideas from the main theme and shifting it around to different places, gradually altering the shape of the figure as it repeats over top of a wandering chord progression that moves off into a whole new harmonic area before arriving climactically back home. However, he'll often keep from altering the rhythmic identity of the initial phrase at all, making it very clear how the new section ties into the previous material. Contrasting this intimate solo harp arrangement, the theme of the White Palace feels much grander and much more solemn, giving the Pale King's theme the full orchestral treatment with thick string pads and a somber harp arpeggio figure at its core. The White Palace has a very obvious connection to the Pale King, being his palace, and the place where you find his corpse. As you can imagine, the area almost feels more like a mausoleum than a palace, and it seems like the music's main focus is to drive this point home. The King's theme from the game's intro is stretched out to occupy 8 bars of 4/4 time rather than 4 bars of 3/4 time, with an additional tag of the opening leap up of a fifth extending the melody to a 12-bar phrase. Notice how we open with the flattened 6th variation rather than the raised 6th version from the Elegy of Hallownest, making for a decidedly darker take on the theme. The melody never really feels finished here. Where the White Lady's theme resolves down to the tonic at the end of each phrase, the White Palace theme opts to sit on the 2nd of the key, the 6th of the underlying minor 4 chord. But even with all of their differences, the two themes share the same blueprint I described earlier. This first statement of the melody is juxtaposed against a variation of the melody that gives us that raised 6th scale degree before wandering off into a whole other direction. The original main rhythmic ideas are maintained, a 2 half-note leap that holds over into the next bar, as well as the 2 quarter note to a half-note rhythm. But the actual notes of the melody shift around to outline a progression that descends steadily through the key of C minor until climaxing on a big ol' 5 chord. I think this approach has to do with Larkin's prioritizing of atmosphere in the soundtrack mixed with his inspiration from classical composers. It seems like he tries to avoid any musical moves that will catch too much attention or take you out of the mood he's trying to set, especially with area themes like this. But he's also explicitly stated that the development of the White Palace theme was inspired by Mahler and Rachmaninoff. Maintaining a consistent rhythmic identity throughout this development allows the melody and harmony to move to new places without ever breaking that underlying atmosphere. The White Palace theme is one of the longer tunes in the soundtrack and moves into an extended development section exploring variations on the arpeggiated harp figure that has underpinned the melody of the tune thus far. It's after this development section winds up that we return to our 2-part melodic section, this time scored for a powerful climax. Though it's on a much larger scale, the piece is following the same formula that we established in the much simpler White Lady's theme. Just like the Elegy of Hallownest that opens up the game, there are plenty of plot points and details about the game's world that require some investigation to really understand. For instance, Hornet, one of the main characters that you run into throughout the game, is actually the Pale King's daughter. This was deduced by players from multiple characters' dialogue from all over the game world, but if Mossbag couldn't convince you, allow me to throw another piece of evidence on the pile. Hornet's theme, the music that plays when fighting her, is actually a rearrangement of the same King's theme that we've been talking about this whole video. The way it's phrased is totally flipped on its head, so it's not immediately obvious, but if you look closely, you'll definitely be able to hear it. The original melody is made up of 4 bars, starting on the tonic in bar 1 and resolving to the tonic in bar 4. This makes a complete sounding phrase. The White Palace theme stretched this out into 8 bars, but the spacing of the phrases was identical. Hornet's theme operates a little differently, stretching the original melody out into an 8-bar phrase, but structuring it to land on the tonic on the first beat of the 1st and 5th bars. The initial leap of a 5th moves into the flat 7, flat 6, 4 melody that makes the King's theme so recognizable, But then we get this altered walk down to our tonic. This kicks off a 1-4-3-2 move that's reminiscent of the King's theme without directly quoting it. And then the last two bars are unfailingly filled with some kind of transitionary material to the next phrase. Sometimes that's this intense scalar run, sometimes it's these jabbing chords, and sometimes it's a development of this new 1-4-3-2 phrase through different tonal centers. A boss fight theme as well as Hornet's character theme, the music has different roles to fulfill compared to our earlier examples. For this reason, much of the development section is elaborating on accompaniment figures used throughout the melody, like the 16th note scalar pattern or these stabbing 8th note shots. The piece culminates in this polyrhythmic 4/3 pattern with the violin and piano playing blazing fast scalar patterns in opposite directions. That part doesn't really have anything to do with the Pale King, but it's just awesome. Hollow Knight is a game that cares about its lore and is very deliberate about how it reveals information to the player. It's partially due to this approach to storytelling that the game grew such a dedicated fan base, with people still coming out with new theories and interpretations of in-game events 2 years after the game's release. One element of the game that's slightly underexplored is the music, and the music works to tell the game's story just as much as all of the other elements in the game's world. The fact that the Pale King's theme is woven throughout the soundtrack like this just goes to show how deliberate Team Cherry was about involving the music in their storytelling. This idea is something I want to explore further in the next and final video in this Hollow Knight series, so look forward to that. If you enjoyed the video and want to help support the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon here. If you hate looking at new tweets, feel free to follow me on Twitter because you won't have to worry about that. And if you want all of your friends to know just how big of a nerd you really are, consider buying an 8-Bit Music Theory t-shirt here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.